The street is almost empty. Dawn presses softly against narrow windows, turning the glass pale blue. A tramline hums somewhere beyond sight, its distant vibration blending with the steady rhythm of a baker kneading dough behind a half-open door. Curtains sway gently on the second floor of a stone building, rising and falling like quiet breathing. Nothing burns. No sirens cut through the air. No soldiers march past in rigid formation. It feels like an ordinary morning. And yet this is where the story begins. Most of us carry an image of occupation that arrives fully formed. We imagine noise first. Explosions. Endless gunfire. Heavy boots. On every corner. Flags replacing flags in dramatic ceremony. Cinema taught us that occupation looks like permanent crisis. Like a city trapped inside a single, violent scene that never fades to black. History books often reinforce it, with sharp contrasts. Heroes and villains drawn in thick lines. But reality is rarely so theatrical. There were arrests. There were disappearances. There were nights when doors were forced open and names were whispered with fear. Brutality was not fiction. It carved scars into memory and stone alike. Yet those moments did not fill every hour. Most hours were quieter. The baker still woke before sunrise. The tram still followed its rails. Children still traced familiar routes to school. Occupation did not exist only in explosions. It lived in the spaces between them. This is the part rarely shown. The long stretches of waiting. The afternoons measured in ration lines. The careful glance before speaking too openly. The way fear settles into posture, rather than shouting its presence. Fear does not always scream. Sometimes it lowers its voice and waits patient, as dust collecting on a windowsill. And something even more unsettling happens in that quiet. People adapt. Not because they agree, not because they forget, but because survival demands rhythm. A body cannot remain in panic forever. A city cannot function in constant alarm. So routines rebuild themselves around new rules. Bread is baked under watchful eyes. Newspapers, print, thinner columns. Conversations shorten when unfamiliar footsteps approach. From a distance, it looks calm. That calm is misleading. When we imagine occupation as endless chaos, we prepare ourselves to spot it easily. We expect visible breakdown. But what if the truer shape is subtler? What if it resembles an ordinary morning that simply refuses to end? A day where nothing dramatic happens, yet nothing feels entirely free. The myth is not wrong because it exaggerates violence. The myth is dangerous because it simplifies experience. It suggests that life under occupation is one constant emotional pitch. Terror, without pause, or courage, without doubt. It leaves no room for the grey hours where people stand in line, exchange quiet nods, and calculate what must be said and what must be swallowed. Human behaviour under pressure does not fit clean labels. It bends. It compromises. It protects. It waits. If occupation does not always look like war, then perhaps we've been looking for the wrong signs all along. To understand it, we must step away from the dramatic frame and return to the beginning, to the first days when rumour hardened into presence, and silence carried more weight than noise. When the moment finally arrives, it does not announce itself the way we expect. There is no single thunderclap dividing yesterday from today. Instead, radios fall quiet mid-sentence. Government doors close without explanation. Clerks remove papers from their desks and lock drawers. They may never open again. Somewhere in the centre of the city, a flag is lowered and another is raised, but only a handful of people witness it. Most hear about it later, second-hand, as rumour. The streets do not erupt. They suspend. Windows become watchtowers. Curtains shift just enough for cautious eyes to observe patrols moving along familiar routes. No one walks quickly. Footsteps sound louder than usual, as if the pavement itself has grown alert. Conversations shrink to murmurs. The air feels altered, though nothing visible confirms it. Fear is present, but undefined. Who now holds authority? Which rules remain intact? Which punishments are real and which are stories designed to frighten? No official explanation arrives to satisfy these questions. Instead, printed notices appear overnight. Curfews typed on thin paper are pasted onto walls. A new pattern of patrols begins, subtle but steady. Announcements are read in a measured tone, careful and brief. Occupation does not arrive as a dramatic instant. It seeps in, life bends slightly at first. Shops adjust their hours. Public buildings operate with reduced staff. A checkpoint appears at an intersection where children once played. Nothing collapses. It simply shifts. The transformation is quiet enough to almost ignore. If one wishes to, hesitation becomes the dominant emotion. Most people do not rush into resistance. They do not pledge allegiance to the new authority either. They assess. They watch who is arrested and who is left alone. They measure which words are safe and which linger too long in the air. Every glance carries calculation. Every decision is provisional survival. In these first days begins with observation. Inside homes, families gather at tables where meals taste different, though the ingredients are the same. Questions rise, but remain half-formed. Parents choose answers carefully. Children sense the tension, but cannot name it. Outside, patrols pass at regular intervals, not aggressively, but deliberately. Enough to remind, not enough to provoke. The first sound of occupation is not gunfire. It is quiet. That quiet is heavier than noise. It stretches time. It leaves space for imagination to fill in worst-case scenarios. People rehearse possibilities in their minds. What if this lasts? What if it worsens? What if nothing changes at all? And this becomes the new normal. In the absence of immediate catastrophe, routine begins to feel like defiance simply because it continues. Bread is bought, streets are swept, buses run, and yet every action is carried out with a slight inward tension, as if the city itself is holding its breath. Occupation, in these opening days, feels less like collapse and more like suspension. Not a storm, but a pause before weather decides its direction. But breath cannot be held forever. Waiting exhausts itself. Eventually, routines must resume with greater certainty, and when they do, the deeper complications of daily life under occupation begin to unfold. Days pass, then weeks. The suspended breath slowly releases, though no one quite remembers deciding to exhale. Shops reopen with adjusted hours. School bells ring again. Their sound thinner than before, but steady. Newspapers return to the stands, their headlines trimmed and reshaped, certain sentences missing, certain phrases repeated with careful precision. The city moves. Ration cards replace the easy exchange of coins. Lines form before sunrise. Patient and quiet. Checkpoints rise at intersections once ignored, and soon they become landmarks. Turn left at the soldiers, someone says casually, as if describing a fountain or a statue. Language adapts without ceremony. Violence has not disappeared. It flares unexpectedly. A neighbor taken at night. A rumor of someone shot for breaking curfew. But the unpredictability makes it stranger than constant terror would. If danger were permanent, perhaps fear could settle into certainty. Instead, it lingers at the edges, appearing without warning, receding without explanation. Most hours are not dramatic. They are administrative. Papers stamped. Names recorded, permits requested, deliveries inspected. The machinery of control hums not through explosions, but through repetition. It is dull, almost tedious. Tired officials at desks. Tired citizens, waiting their turn. The extraordinary reshapes itself into routine. This is the unsettling transformation. Occupation does not replace life. It settles inside it. A shopkeeper continues selling bread to anyone who enters. He does not ask questions. He does not want answered. Is he preserving commerce, feeding families, keeping a fragile normalcy intact? Or is he enabling a system that tightens its grip each week? The answer shifts depending on who is asking. A teacher revises her lessons, removing certain authors, skipping certain dates. She tells herself she is protecting her students from punishment. She still teaches them to think quietly, in careful ways. A clerk stamps "permits" with the new insignia at the top of each page. Without his signature, food shipments would stall. Water repairs would halt. Hospitals would lack supplies. He convinces himself that continuity prevents collapse. Yet, each stamp feels heavier than the last. These are not cinematic choices. There are no swelling scores behind them. There is no single moment when someone declares allegiance. Instead, Decisions unfold slowly, in fragments, one practical step at a time. The real battle moves inward. It happens at kitchen tables after curfew, in whispered debates between partners who disagree about what is safe, what is necessary, what crosses a line. It happens in private calculations, how much to comply, how much to quietly resist, how long to endure. Conscience negotiates with necessity every day, rarely reaching a clean conclusion. From outside, life appears orderly. Trams run. Streets are swept. Markets function, even if sparse. From inside, something is shifting. When the abnormal becomes ordinary, perception changes. A uniform that once drew shock now barely interrupts conversation. A new rule, first met with outrage, later recited without emotion. The mind adjusts to protect itself from constant strain. And once perception shifts, identity follows. People begin to see themselves not as citizens under temporary occupation, but as inhabitants of a new structure. However unwanted, the frame of reference narrows. Choices are evaluated within altered boundaries. It is here, in repetition and routine, that occupation becomes most complex. Not in spectacle, but in adaptation. And if daily life is shaped by these grey decisions, then the next step is inevitable. The lines between survival, cooperation, and resistance begin to blur in ways history later simplifies. But those living through it cannot. The marketplace opens under careful eyes. Stalls are arranged with deliberate precision, baskets placed where they have always been, though fewer goods fill them now. Patrols move slowly along the edges, not rushing, not shouting, simply present. Conversations dip as boots approach, then rise again when distance returns. The rhythm of trade continues, but every gesture feels measured, weighed before release. Food has become arithmetic. Flour is counted. Without the proper paper, a livelihood vanishes overnight. Without the correct stamp, a shipment does not arrive. Survival depends less on strength than on paperwork employment. 2. Shifts its allegiance. Factories reopen under new oversight. Offices function beneath new symbols. To earn wages, one must register. To register, one must comply. The choice is not abstract, it is immediate. A signature on a form means groceries at week's end. Refusal may mean nothing in the cupboard. This is where discomfort settles in. Later generations may look back and speak in firm terms. Collaborator, loyalist, traitor. But here, in the market's narrow lanes, the question feels different. A mother trades small valuables for medicine. A father accepts a position repairing vehicles used by the occupying forces because his previous employer disappeared. A shopkeeper applies for permission to continue operating because his employees depend on him. What would you trade to keep your family safe? The line between protection and participation is thinner than it appears from a distance. Actions taken to secure food or medicine also stabilize the system that imposes the shortages. Refusal carries moral clarity, perhaps, but also risk. Hunger is not philosophical. It arrives daily. Children do not debate ethics at the table. They ask if there will be enough. Moral tension intensifies in quiet ways. To refuse cooperation can mean hunger, eviction, or to comply can mean living with the knowledge that one's labor supports an unwanted order. Neither path is clean. Both carry consequence. Silence becomes the common language. Neighbors discuss prices and weather, but not loyalties. Public agreement masks private doubts. In the evening, behind closed doors, conversations lower further. Families debate what is necessary and what crosses into complicity. They adjust their reasoning to fit the day's demands. Tomorrow may require a different calculation. Communities appear united from afar. Flags wave, markets function. Children still gather to play, but suspicion hums beneath the surface. Who benefits too easily? Who was seen speaking with an officer longer than required? Who applied for a permit without hesitation? Trust thins, not always from betrayal, but from uncertainty. Emotional isolation deepens. People cannot express their true positions openly. To speak carelessly is to invite scrutiny. To remain silent is to protect oneself. Over time, restraint becomes instinctive. Survival decisions rarely feel grand. They happen in increments. One document signed. One job accepted. one compromise justified as temporary. Each step is small, almost invisible. Yet together, they shape a life. From outside, these actions may be labeled later. Inside the moment, they are immediate responses to immediate threats. Hunger does not wait for moral purity. Illness does not pause for ideological debate. The marketplace closes at dusk. Stalls are dismantled. Unsold, goods wrapped tightly. Patrols complete their rounds. Families return home carrying what they managed to secure. The weight in their hands is lighter than the weight in their thoughts. Some of these choices will remain small, confined to kitchen tables and quiet streets. Others will expand, pulling ordinary people into roles that sustain the machinery of occupation itself. The uniforms at the checkpoints may be foreign, but the faces behind the desks often are not. Patrols continue through familiar neighborhoods, sometimes led by local officers who once enforced entirely different laws. Police stations reopen with minimal ceremony. Clerks unlock municipal buildings at the same hour as before. Papers are sorted, stamped, filed. Streetlights are repaired. Water flows through pipes, maintained by workers who know every valve and rusted bolt. From the outside, it appears that control descends fully formed, imposed from above, but the machinery of occupation is more complicated. It hums because it is connected to what already existed. The occupiers ruled, but they did not rule alone. An external authority can seize a capital, raise a flag, but without local administrators, without familiar structures, power frays quickly, garbage would collect in streets, rail lines would halt, hospitals would lack supplies. Chaos would threaten both the occupied and those attempting to govern them. So continuity becomes essential. Local police keep patrolling. Not always willingly, not always proudly. Some convince themselves their presence prevents harsher enforcement by outsiders. A familiar face may calm a confrontation that would otherwise escalate. A warning given quietly might spare someone an arrest. To leave the position entirely could mean surrendering it to someone less restrained. Travel permits. Employment registrations. Each stamp validates the system, yet without that stamp, daily life would collapse into disorder. Some remain because they believe they can soften the edges. Others stay because they have families to feed. A few recognize opportunity and rise quickly under new leadership. Motives. It becomes difficult to separate necessity from ambition, caution from compromise. The man who remains in his post might be preserving stability. He might also be strengthening control. The woman who accepts promotion under the new administration might be protecting her staff from dismissal. She might also be securing personal advantage. From a distance, judgment seems simple. Resistance and cooperation no longer appear as clean opposites. They begin to resemble points along a shifting spectrum. A local official might comply publicly yet pass information quietly. Another might enforce certain rules while subtly ignoring others. Timing shapes perception. A decision that feels protective one week may look complicit the next. The emotional atmosphere grows heavier. Trust thins further. Who is protecting the community and who is advancing the occupier's agenda? Sometimes the same person appears to be doing both. Conversations become guarded, not only around patrols, but around acquaintances whose roles have changed. Old friendships strain under new suspicion. Yet the city continues to function. Buses run because drivers show up. Schools remain open because administrators submit required reports. Courts process cases because judges occupy their benches. Every routine act strengthens the appearance of order, and order, even imposed, reduces visible unrest. This is the unsettling truth. Occupation is not sustained by force alone. It is stabilized by participation, whether reluctant or eager. It borrows the infrastructure of the society it controls and repurposes it. Understanding this does not erase resistance. It complicates it. If survival and administration define one side of occupation, then resistance must define another. But resistance is rarely as sweeping or unified as memory later suggests. It begins elsewhere, often in corners where bureaucracy cannot fully reach. After war's end, memory sharpens into symbols. Posters appear. Films are made. Stories are retold at anniversaries with steady pride. We see brave faces in dimly lit rooms planning sabotage. We hear about coded messages passed beneath door frames. Trains derailed in the night. bold declarations, whispered before capture. In these retellings, resistance feels broad and constant, as if an entire population stood in quiet unity, waiting only for the right moment to strike. It is an image that comforts. But resistance, in reality, was rarely so expansive. To join an underground network required courage of a rare kind. It meant accepting the possibility of imprisonment, torture, execution, not only for oneself, but for family. Informants were everywhere, or at least it felt that way. Suspicion could end lives. Cells were fragmented precisely because trust was fragile. Many networks never reached beyond a handful of names. Some collapsed before accomplishing anything at all. Statistically, the number of active resistors in most occupied territories was small. That fact does not diminish their bravery. It only makes it clearer how dangerous resistance truly was. Most people were neither fighters nor collaborators. They existed in between. They woke early, stood in ration lines, performed assigned work, lowered their voices at checkpoints, and returned home before curfew. They did not plant explosives or publish secret pamphlets. Yet they also did not pledge loyalty with enthusiasm. They endured. They adjusted. They preserved what fragments of normal life they could. Some practiced forms of resistance so subtle they barely registered at the time. A teacher slipping banned literature into a lesson disguised as grammar. A worker deliberately slowing production without attracting attention. A neighbor passing along quiet information about patrol routes. These acts did not make headlines. They rarely appeared in official reports. Yet each carried risk. Heroism begins to look different when viewed from this angle. It is not always loud. It is often private. It may not involve dramatic confrontation, but instead the refusal to let something meaningful disappear completely. A tradition maintained in secret. A language spoken softly at home. A small defiance embedded in an ordinary day. History remembers heroes. But who remembers the silent majority? The majority carried a different burden. They navigated impossible terrain without clear guidance. Each decision was weighed against survival. Each day demanded calculation. The absence of bold resistance did not mean absence of moral struggle. It meant the stakes were relentlessly personal. Over time, another quiet transformation occurred. Even before liberation seemed possible, people began imagining how this period would be told. Would they be judged, misunderstood, forgiven? Conversations at dinner tables sometimes drifted toward the future. When this ends, someone would say, softly, as if testing the phrase, actions taken in the present were measured against an uncertain tomorrow. A man might refuse a promotion not only because he feared complicity, but because he feared how it would look later. A woman might keep a record of her quiet acts of kindness, unsure whether memory alone would protect her reputation. Even during occupation, people were shaping the version of themselves that history might inherit. That awareness adds another layer to survival. It was not only about enduring the present, but anticipating the verdict of the future. As resistance, cooperation, and endurance blurred together, a larger truth emerged. The story later told would be cleaner than the life actually lived. And when liberation finally arrived, that story would collide with reality in ways no one fully expected. One morning, the boots do not return. There is no announcement, no sudden parade marking the end. The narrow streets wake as they always have, but something is missing. The echo that once followed patrols through stone alleys has faded. The checkpoint at the corner stands unmanned, its barrier lifted and swaying slightly in the breeze. Orders that once arrived with cold precision simply stop coming. The occupation does not end in spectacle. It dissolves. At first, no one speaks of it openly. Rumors move ahead of confirmation. A convoy seen departing at dawn. An officer's residence abandoned overnight. Someone claims the outer districts are already clear. These fragments travel through kitchens and workshops, carried in low voices that still expect interruption. Hope rises carefully, as if afraid of being overheard. Over the next days, the signs become more visible. Patrol routes thin. Flags disappear from government buildings, removed quietly under darkness. The insignia that once dominated public squares seems less secure, less permanent. Windows open wider. People linger longer at doorways. Yet celebration does not erupt. Liberation, when it comes, is not a clean emotional release. It feels cautious, disbelieving, strangely muted. After years of calibrated behavior, no one quite knows how to stand without calculating. How loudly can one speak now? How directly can one look another in the eye? The habits formed under watchful authority do not vanish with its departure. When the soldiers left, why did the silence remain? Fear lingers in the body like a memory of cold. Voices stay low, even when no patrol passes. People glance over shoulders out of reflex. Children ask whether they may run freely down streets, once avoided. Parents hesitate before answering, as if permission itself requires paperwork. Freedom should feel expansive. Instead, it feels uncertain. The routines that once structured daily survival suddenly evaporate. Curfews are no longer enforced. Permits no longer required. Orders no longer dictate movement. The weight that pressed down on every decision has lifted, but without it, something else surfaces. Space. And in that space, new tensions begin to breathe. For years, survival shaped behavior. People knew which roles to play, which silences to maintain, which gestures to avoid. Now, those scripts dissolve. Conversations grow louder. Laughter emerges, then dims, as if unsure whether joy is allowed. Relief carries its own complexity. It is difficult to release fear all at once. Some remain skeptical, waiting for a reversal. Others feel an unexpected emptiness, as though a constant adversary provided structure simply by existing. Occupation created rules that were harsh but clear. Liberation removes those rules overnight, and with that removal comes a heavier question. Without an external authority defining right and wrong, who defines it now? People begin to look at each other differently. Not yet accusing, not yet confrontational, just aware. A neighbour who once walked confidently beside patrols now walks more quietly. A clerk who stamped permits daily avoids meeting certain eyes. Those who resisted cautiously wonder whether their secrecy will matter or be misunderstood. The streets grow louder by degrees. Flags reappear, this time chosen by local hands. Public squares fill slowly, but beneath the gathering relief, something unsettled stirs. Freedom did not restore simplicity, it removed restraint. And as relief shifts into visibility, suppressed tensions begin to rise. Soon, the quiet question will surface fully in the open air. Who stood where during the occupation? Relief settles only briefly before something sharper replaces it. Faces once passed without comment are now studied in daylight. The grocer who secured extra supplies. The clerk who remained at his desk. The officer who continued his rounds under altered insignia. People who blended into routine suddenly stand out against it. Freedom arrived. So did the accusations. At first, they travel in whispers. Stories retold with new emphasis. Glances exchanged that linger longer than before. Then whispers harden into statements. Names are spoken publicly. Crowds gather outside homes. Papers are examined with trembling fingers. Records once routine become evidence. Communities begin identifying collaborators, sometimes accurately, sometimes emotionally. The desire for clarity presses forward with urgency. For years, moral boundaries were blurred by necessity. Now, there is hunger for lines drawn clean and sharp. Public shaming appears first. Heads shaved in squares. Placards hung around necks. Then, arrests follow. Rapid trials convene in hastily assembled rooms where anger and relief mingle uneasily. Verdicts are delivered with speed that suggests confidence. Yet the process feels compressed, almost breathless. The grey zone that defined daily survival collapses into simpler categories. Loyal or traitor, victim or accomplice. The space in between narrows quickly, but reality does not fit the new labels easily. Many of those punished are visible administrators. Clerks who process permits, police who stayed in uniform, officials who continued municipal duties. Their actions are documented, their roles undeniable. They are easy to identify. Meanwhile, some who benefited quietly from occupation avoid scrutiny. Those who profited from contracts, who maneuvered behind closed doors, who aligned themselves strategically yet discreetly, remain less visible. Their influence was real, but their involvement less public. The reckoning becomes uneven. This is the strongest and most unsettling truth of liberation. Justice, hurried by emotion, does not always move in straight lines. Anger seeks targets it can see. Pain looks for faces it recognizes. The complexity of survival is swept aside by the need for resolution. Psychologically, the shift is understandable. After years of moral ambiguity, people crave certainty. They want to believe that right and wrong can be sorted quickly, that harm can be measured and punished in proportion. Clean divisions offer relief. They restore a sense of order that occupation disturbed. But clarity achieved too swiftly can fracture communities further. Former neighbours avoid eye contact in the market. Conversations break off when certain names are mentioned. Long silent suspicions now have voice. And those voices are not always restrained. Some accusations are precise and justified. Others ride waves of resentment that began long before occupation. Liberation becomes exposure. Private choices made in kitchens and offices surface under public light. Explanations that once felt reasonable inside a family circle sound insufficient before a crowd. Tears and denials blur together. The atmosphere feels tense, almost brittle, as if a single spark could shatter fragile unity. Those who resisted quietly watch events unfold with conflicted feelings. They longed for this moment, yet they see nuance disappearing. Those who survived by compromise struggle to articulate their reasoning in a climate that demands absolutes. Judgments are declared, punishments delivered. Some feel vindicated, others feel uneasy. Freedom, which promised harmony, reveals division instead. And as the immediate reckoning settles, another struggle begins to form. Not about guilt alone, but about narrative. With consequences handed down and labels assigned, a quieter conflict emerges. Who will shape the story of these years, and whose version will endure? As the streets quiet after the reckoning, attention shifts from confrontation to narration. Newspapers print bold new headlines. Words like resistance and liberation appear in heavy type, repeated until they feel solid and undeniable. Photographs circulate of defiant gestures and hidden meetings brought into daylight. Names of heroes are spoken with admiration. Their faces become symbols. Easy to recognize, easy to celebrate. The war ended. The editing began. Societies emerging from occupation search for stable ground. Identity feels shaken, uncertain. To restore it, stories are arranged carefully. Resistance becomes headline. Compromise becomes footnote. Complex realities are compressed into cleaner shapes that can be taught, remembered, honored. This process does not feel malicious. It feels necessary. People long for pride after humiliation, for clarity after confusion. Elevating heroes provides direction. It reassures communities that courage defined them more than fear did. It suggests that even under control, a collective spirit endured intact. But nuance does not fit easily into parades or schoolbooks. The first version of history is written under emotional urgency, not reflection. It emerges from fresh wounds and visible scars. Stories become moral anchors, offering stability in a landscape still unsettled. When pain is recent, patience is rare. There is little appetite for ambiguity. Those who survived in the grey zones notice this quickly. Their experiences do not align neatly with the new narrative. Feeding children through negotiated permits does not translate into a triumphant headline. Keeping a municipal service functioning to prevent collapse sounds less noble beside tales of sabotage. Avoiding violence by complying in small ways seems difficult to explain without sounding defensive. So many remain silent. First, silence feels temporary. There will be time later to discuss the in-between years. But time passes, and the dominant version hardens. Schools teach simplified arcs. Public ceremonies honor specific acts. Memorials carve names in stone. The grey becomes thinner with each retelling. Silence begins to feel protective. To challenge the emerging narrative risks misunderstanding. It can appear as justification. It can sound like diminishing heroism rather than adding depth. And so, kitchens once filled with careful debate grow quiet about those choices. Diaries remain closed in drawers. Letters are tucked away. Memory, shaped by relief and anger, settles into form. Liberation ends occupation physically, but it begins another process entirely. Myth-making. Stories that feel clean and purposeful are easier to pass down. They travel smoothly across generations. They offer certainty to those who did not live through doubt. Yet something is quietly lost. When complexity is postponed, it does not disappear. It lingers beneath the surface, waiting for distance to soften defenses. The official version may celebrate resistance and condemn collaboration, but daily life under occupation contained layers that neither label fully captures. If liberation reshapes memory, what parts of those ordinary mornings and difficult evenings were quietly erased? The bakery that stayed open under watchful eyes, the teacher who rewrote lessons to shield students, the clerk who stamped papers, believing it prevented harsher control. Their stories fade into the margins, neither glorified nor fully condemned. Chapter by chapter, the narrative becomes steadier, but beneath the steadiness lies tension. What remains unspoken does not vanish. It settles inside people, shaping how they see themselves long after banners are folded and speeches conclude. And as the first version of history takes hold, something else lingers, not in buildings or borders, but within the minds of those who live through it, carrying habits and memories that do not fit neatly into print. Years pass. The streets are busy again. Cafes spill onto sidewalks. Flags hang freely from windows without fear of reprisal. Markets are louder than they once were, and children run without checking the end of every alley before turning a corner. On the surface, life appears restored. And yet something subtle remains. People still lower their voices in public. Even when discussing harmless matters, sentences soften instinctively. Opinions are phrased carefully, as if an invisible audience might still be listening. Laughter sometimes breaks off mid-breath when an unfamiliar face approaches. No patrol follows. No officer takes notes. But the reflex lingers. Even after freedom returned, why did people still whisper? Occupation leaves behind more than empty checkpoints and faded insignia. It leaves psychological architecture. Structures of caution built slowly over years do not collapse overnight. Part of the interior landscape, guiding behavior long after the original threat has dissolved. Children who grew up during those years mature into adults, shaped by constant calculation. They learned early to assess rooms before speaking. They understood which conversations were safe at home and which were not. That training does not simply disappear because the rules changed. It settles into posture and tone. Survival habits harden quietly into personality traits. Distrust becomes instinctive, not loud suspicion, but a subtle reserve. When new policies are introduced, people scan for hidden meaning. When leaders promise transparency, a quiet skepticism waits behind polite nods. Experience taught them that appearances can shift without warning. Silence becomes comfortable. During occupation, silence was protective. Words carried risk. Now, silence feels natural. Even when risk has receded, conversations remain measured. Debates lack the reckless openness of society, untouched by prolonged watchfulness. Freedom is present, yet expression feels cautious. Even ordinary gestures carry faint echoes. Showing identification, once a compulsory ritual, leaves a trace in muscle memory. Waiting in lines without complaint feels familiar. Keeping receipts. Documenting small transactions. Preserving proof of compliance. All habits that once served survival continue without conscious decision. The tone of public life changes in ways difficult to quantify. Authority may no longer wear foreign insignia, but authority itself is regarded with a different eye. Trust in institutions rebuilds, slowly, cautiously. People respect laws, but they do not assume permanence. They have seen systems change too quickly to believe in absolute stability. The most unsettling truth is this: liberation restores sovereignty, but it cannot immediately restore confidence. Confidence depends on predictability, on the belief that speaking openly carries no hidden consequence. That belief takes time. Years of careful behavior reshape not only public routine but private instinct. Some notice it in themselves unexpectedly: a hesitation before signing a petition, a reluctance to criticize openly, even in safe company, a preference for keeping opinions within trusted circle, rather than broadcasting them widely. None of these reactions are dramatic. They are subtle, almost invisible. Yet together, they form a quiet inheritance of occupation. From a distance, the nation looks free. From within, individuals carry patterns shaped under constraint. The external authority is gone, but the internal echo remains. And if habits endure, if caution settles into identity, then relationships shaped during those years cannot return unchanged either. Silence and suspicion do not dissolve evenly. They linger between neighbors, between friends, between families, waiting to be understood. In the years that follow liberation, public life settles into rhythm again. Cafes fill. Elections are held. Streets host celebrations without fear of interruption. From a distance, the communities appears whole, stitched back together by time and shared survival. But fractures remain. Families once united by necessity find themselves divided by memory. A brother who worked in a municipal office refuses to sit beside a sister who sheltered fugitives. A father avoids discussing the years he spent repairing vehicles for occupying forces, insisting he did what was required. At holiday tables, certain topics are approached cautiously, then abandoned altogether. Occupation ended. Suspicion did not. Public trials may have concluded, verdicts delivered, punishments served. Yet private judgments linger without formal closure. Resentment settles quietly in corners of conversation. Shame grows and grows. Silence. Some feel misunderstood, judged too harshly for choices made under pressure. Others feel betrayal, never fully acknowledged. The deepest divisions are rarely discussed openly. In public gatherings, unity is emphasized. Speeches celebrate collective endurance. Flags wave without hesitation. The language of solidarity replaces the language of accusation. But beneath this, surface cohesion, emotional separation, persists. Neighbors who once shared bread in ration lines now exchange polite greetings without warmth. Invitations are declined with vague excuses. Old friendships become formal. Distance grows not from new harm, but from unresolved interpretation of old decisions. Communities learn to live with this tension. Outwardly, stability returns. Inwardly, people carry quiet questions. Who truly resisted? Who simply survived? Who crossed a line that cannot be easily forgiven? These questions are rarely asked directly. They hover, implied but unspoken. Children grow up inside these silences. At dinner tables, they absorb simplified versions of what happened. Parents frame their own actions carefully, emphasizing necessity or courage as needed. Certain neighbors are described with subtle disapproval. Other names are spoken with pride. Over time, these fragments solidify into inherited narratives. A child learns not only history, but position within it. Generational identity forms around these stories. Some grow up believing their family stood firmly against oppression. Others sense an unspoken need to defend past choices. The nuance that once defined daily life becomes compressed into moral shorthand. Occupation shifts from an external force to an internal reference point. It becomes less about foreign authority and more about how society interprets itself afterward. Who are we? Were we brave? Were we compromised? The answers vary, depending on who speaks. This internal reckoning does not unfold dramatically. It manifests in cautious friendships, in selective memory, in the careful way certain anniversaries are observed. People move forward, do not always move together. The invisible divide is difficult to measure because it rarely announces itself. It exists in avoidance, in tone, in the subjects that never quite enter public discussion. It shapes community dynamics without appearing in official records. Time softens some edges, but it does not erase structure. Emotional architecture, built during occupation, continues to influence trust and belonging. A shared past does not guarantee a shared interpretation. As memory hardens into story and story hardens into identity, clarity becomes harder to recover. The question that once seemed simple grows more complex. What was truly ordinary during those years, and what was permanently changed beneath the surface? When we look back, the temptation is to divide the past into clear shapes. To name certain acts heroic, others disgraceful, and let the story rest there. But daily life under occupation resists this simplicity. It does not align neatly with the dramatic arcs we prefer. What was normal then? Bread lines were normal. Standing in cold air with ration cards folded carefully in a pocket, listening for footsteps, calculating whether supplies would last the week. Paperwork was normal. Forms requested, documents stamped, permissions granted or denied in offices that looked unchanged yet felt entirely altered. School lessons were normal, though adjusted, pages removed. Names avoided, questions answered cautiously. None of it resembled cinema. These routines were not glamorous. They did not involve bold declarations or visible rebellion. They involved endurance. They required attention to detail, patience, and constant internal negotiation. The extraordinary condition of occupation filtered itself into ordinary tasks. It is here that the reality was not constant terror. There were days of fear, certainly, nights interrupted, sudden arrests, moments when danger pressed close. But there were also afternoons of routine. Children still learned multiplication tables. Workers repaired broken sidewalks. Markets opened and closed in familiar rhythm. Nor was reality quiet acceptance. There were small resistances embedded in those routines. A phrase slipped into a lesson. A delivery, deliberately. A warning passed discreetly. Cooperation occurred too often out of necessity. Sometimes out of ambition. The balance shifted day by day. Occupation was fluctuation. Fear one morning. Relative calm the next. Resentment whispered in kitchens. Pragmatism practiced in offices. Survival strategies that looked different depending on who was observing. History chose its heroes, but daily life chose survival. That is not a dismissal of courage. It is a recognition of proportion. Heroism was visible because it was rare and costly. Endurance was widespread because it was necessary. Most people did not wake up asking how to define themselves morally. They woke asking how to get through the day without harm. Moving beyond myth does not diminish bravery. It restores texture. It reminds us that moral extremes are easier to narrate than to live. The shopkeeper who sold bread to anyone. The teacher who sewed revised lessons just enough to avoid scrutiny. The clerk who signed forms to keep services running. None fit comfortably into legend. Yet, they represent the majority experience. To understand occupation honestly requires humility. It asks us to step away from judgment, delivered decades later, and step inside the uncertainty of those moments, to replace the question, who was brave, with something more unsettling. What would I have done? That question lingers because it has no fixed answer. We imagine ourselves defiant, certain, unwavering, but certainty is easier in hindsight. Under sustained pressure, moral clarity becomes clouded by practical need. The myth was dramatic. The reality was ordinary. And perhaps that is more disturbing, because if occupation can settle into routine, if abnormal conditions can feel almost normal, then the lesson is back. Not about distant history alone. It is about the human capacity to adapt quietly to whatever shape the world takes. And with that awareness, the story moves forward, not toward spectacle, but toward reinterpretation, where distance begins to reveal what proximity concealed. Decades pass, and the cities look restored. Streets have been renamed after heroes. Monuments rise where checkpoints once stood. Museums display artifacts beneath careful lighting. The occupation appears sealed between covers of textbooks, arranged into chapters with defined beginnings and clean endings. It seems complete, and yet something feels unfinished. In family homes, certain years remain blurred at the edges. Conversations drift toward safer subjects when the past edges too close. Public ceremonies honor resistance with polished speeches, but private compromises remain unspoken. For a long time, silence settles like dust over daily life. It would be easy to assume this silence was imposed. That fear continued to press down even after liberation, but often it was chosen. Those who navigated the grey zones of survival did not always feel safe sharing their stories. Not because they had committed crimes, but because their experiences resisted simple explanation. Complexity does not fit easily into national myth. The shopkeeper who kept his store open under supervision may have believed he preserved stability. The clerk who processed permits may have felt he prevented harsher outcomes. The parent who discouraged open dissent may have done so to keep children safe. None of these actions translated neatly into the bold language of victory and pride. So stories were edited quietly at kitchen tables. Children grew up hearing simplified versions. We did what we had to. Those were hard times. Questions were gently redirected. Difficult details dissolved into familiar phrases. It was complicated. Better not to dwell on it. The past is past. If daily life wasn't what we think, why didn't anyone explain it sooner? Sometimes the answer was dignity. To speak openly risked misunderstanding. To revisit old decisions meant reopening private doubts. Those who survived in ambiguity often carried lingering shame, even if their choices were pragmatic. Others carried resentment at being judged by standards shaped in hindsight. Silence became a form of protection. It preserved family unity. It shielded reputations. It allowed communities to move forward without dismantling fragile cohesion. Memory, once sharp and urgent, softened into something more delicate. Handling it required care. In public, occupation transformed into narrative. In private, it remained experience. Letters were stored in drawers. Diaries were tucked behind shelves. Photographs from those years remained in albums, but rarely discussed in detail. Children sensed weight in the room when certain names were mentioned. They learned without explicit instruction which topics belonged to history class and which belonged to quiet reflection. Over time, the silence shaped identity as surely as the events themselves. Entire generations inherited an understanding of occupation, filtered through protection. Pride was emphasized. Complexity was minimized. The result was not falsehood, but compression. Occupation did not truly end at liberation. It lingered in what was avoided, in the careful phrasing of family anecdotes, in the pause before answering a probing question, in the tension between public celebration and private memory. The years no one spoke about did not disappear. They waited, resting beneath the surface of conversation, and eventually something would shift. Silence, held too long, begins to change shape. It cracks, not violently, but slowly, as distance softens. Fear and curiosity grows stronger than caution. Silence does not last forever. One day, a drawer is opened in an attic room. Inside, wrapped carefully in aging cloth, lie letters written in careful handwriting. In another house, a diary is found behind old books, its pages filled with dates that once felt dangerous to record. Decades have softened the fear that sealed these documents away. The people who wrote them are older now, their voices steadier, their urgency replaced with reflection. What happens when the people who lived it finally speak without fear? At first, the stories emerge quietly, a local interview recorded for an archive, a grandmother answering questions she once avoided, a former clerk explaining, without defensiveness, why he remained at his post. The tone is different from earlier years. There is less need to justify, more willingness to describe. Time changes perspective. Distance allows complexity to surface without feeling like betrayal. Survivors begin to recount the texture of daily life rather than the simplified version history preserved. They speak of small compromises that kept families intact. They describe moments of unexpected kindness. An officer who looked away at the right time, a neighbor who shared extra rationed bread despite differences. These stories do not fit clean categories. They challenge the image of constant defiance or constant submission. They reveal survival strategies that were neither heroic nor dishonorable, but practical and immediate. They show how fear and routine intertwined, how morality shifted with circumstance. This does not erase wrongdoing. Accounts of harm remain. People remember betrayals, arrests, acts of cruelty, but alongside these, other memories stand quietly. Acts of caution that prevented escalation, choices made to reduce damage rather than to support oppression. The sealed room of memory begins to open. Dust lingers in the air. For years, silence preserves stability. Now, light filters in gradually. Scholars listen carefully. Historians revisit old records with new questions. They search not only for dramatic events, but for patterns of daily behavior. Communities hold discussions, once considered too sensitive. The re-evaluation is not an attempt to excuse. It is an attempt to understand context. Why did so many remain in administrative roles? How did economic pressure shape moral decisions? What did resistance look like in households that could not risk open defiance? These questions complicate long-held assumptions. Public memory adjusts slowly. Some welcome the nuance, relieved that their private experiences are finally acknowledged. Others feel unsettled. A narrative once stable begins to shift. Pride must make room for ambiguity. Certainty yields to layered explanation. As more diaries are published and interviews recorded, a mosaic forms. It does not replace the original narrative entirely. It adds to it. The heroic stories remain, but they are no longer alone. Authenticity grows more valuable than legend. For those who lived through occupation, speaking now feels less like confession and more like contribution. They are not defending past choices. They are describing conditions as they truly were. The aim is not redemption. It is clarity. But clarity carries weight. As memories surface and revision gathers momentum, tension begins to stir. Reinterpretation can feel threatening to those who relied on simpler explanations. The past, once firmly arranged, becomes fluid again. And with that fluidity comes an uneasy question. How much complexity is a society prepared to accept about itself? As the sealed room opens and light reaches corners long kept dim. Not everyone welcomes what is revealed. The conflict that follows is not fought in streets, but in lecture halls, newspapers, and quiet arguments around dinner tables. Scholars publish findings drawn from diaries and interviews. Historians present data that complicates the familiar arc of resistance and betrayal. Communities gather to discuss what these reinterpretations mean, and almost immediately, tension rises. Where many, the simplified narrative feels safer. It has structure. It protects collective pride. It keeps heroes untarnished and villains clearly defined. It reassures people that their identity emerged from the past intact. When nuance enters, that reassurance trembles. Is the truth uncomfortable? Because it changes who we think we were. The reveal here is unsettling. Complexity does not merely adjust historical detail. It blurs moral boundaries that have been stable for decades. If survival choices were more ambiguous than once believed, then judgment becomes less certain. If those punished were not always the worst offenders, and those celebrated were not entirely untouched by compromise, then memory grows heavier. This destabilization provokes resistance. Some argue that revisiting grey areas undermines honor, that focusing on nuance risks, diminishing genuine bravery. Others fear that acknowledging ambiguity could open old wounds, unnecessarily. There is concern that critical analysis may appear as accusation. The debate moves beyond facts. It becomes emotional. What does this reinterpretation suggest about us as a society? If our parents or grandparents navigated uncertainty rather than absolute righteousness, what does that say about our inherited pride? Identity built upon clarity resists adjustment. Historical debate becomes a mirror. People project their present anxieties onto the past. Those who value certainty push back against fluid narratives. Those who seek authenticity press for fuller accounts. The tension is not about whether events occurred. It is about how they are framed and what that framing implies. Truth, when layered, demands maturity. It asks communities to hold conflicting realities at once. Courage and compromise, kindness and harm, necessity and ambition. That emotional labor can feel exhausting. It requires letting go of comfort, provided by simple binaries. Some retreat into defensiveness. They question motives of researchers. They emphasize the importance of honoring sacrifice without overcomplicating the story. Others advocate that understanding context strengthens rather than weakens collective memory. The argument lingers not because facts are unclear, but because identity is involved. History, it becomes apparent, is not only about what happened. It is about what societies are willing to accept about themselves. The version of occupation embraced publicly shapes how people see their nation, their families, and their own moral capacity. Uncovering reality is not simply academic. It reshapes belonging. It shifts how communities define courage and responsibility. It alters how younger generations interpret inherited narratives. The chapter closes without resolution. The debate continues quietly, sometimes intensely. Complexity does not erase pride, but it challenges it to evolve. And as one society grapples with its layered memory, a wider question emerges. If this struggle exists here, how differently might occupation daily life be remembered elsewhere? Imagine standing in two cities at the same hour under two different skies. In one, narrow streets echo with boots and shouted orders. In another, patrols pass quietly, their presence heavy but restrained. The word occupation applies to both, yet the texture of daily life feels entirely different. Different uniforms, different outcomes. We often speak of occupation as if it were a single, recognizable condition, as if its shape were universal, predictable, uniform across borders. But the reality was deeply local. Geography, ideology, duration, and leadership shaped how control unfolded in each place. What daily life felt like in one region might have been almost unrecognizable in another. Some communities endured extreme brutality, public punishments, sweeping arrests, sudden disappearances that shattered entire neighborhoods. Violence was not sporadic but constant, defining every decision. Fear did not linger at the edges. It dominated elsewhere. Control tightened through regulation more than open force. Permits restricted movement. Censorship adjusted language. Patrols maintained visibility without frequent confrontation. The pressure was steady, bureaucratic, persistent, rather than explosive. Both were occupations. Neither can represent all. What if everything you believe depends on where you are standing? Food systems illustrate this variation clearly. In agricultural regions, families with access to land could stretch resources more effectively. Black markets formed in hidden corners. In dense urban centers dependent on imported goods, shortages were harsher. Ration lines lengthened. Hunger shaped daily choices more dramatically. Social structures mattered as well. In tightly knit communities with strong traditions of mutual aid, informal networks supported survival. Neighbors shared information and resources quietly, reducing isolation. In areas fragmented by previous political divisions or mistrust, occupation intensified existing fractures. Suspicion spread more easily where trust had already weakened. Economic networks influenced survival strategies. Industrial hubs faced pressures tied to production quotas and factory oversight. Rural villages navigated requisitions and inspections differently. Local leadership styles altered enforcement patterns. A strict commander in one district could produce daily anxiety, while a more pragmatic official in another might permit limited flexibility. These differences do not lessen suffering in any location. They complicate it. When we compress occupation into a single narrative, we overlook the fact that experience varied widely. A clerk in one city may have operated under constant scrutiny, while in another, routine persisted with minimal interference. Occupation, daily life cannot be reduced to one template. Understanding this prevents oversimplification. It reminds us that myth often flattens geography into symbol. One image dominates, one story circulates, while countless local variations from view. The invitation here is subtle, but important. Instead of asking what occupation looked like, we begin asking where it looked that way. Which streets, which homes, which systems shaped behavior in that specific place. Perspective shifts accordingly. The closer we examine the map, the more variation we see. Control adapted itself to terrain and population. Survival adapted in response. No single example captures the whole. And if lived experience differed so dramatically from region to region, their memory could not remain uniform either. How a nation remembers occupation depends as much on local reality as on shared narrative. As years stretch into decades, nations begin to tell their stories with greater confidence. Borders stabilize. Governments change. Textbooks are printed and reprinted, each edition refining the language of the past. Children learn about occupation through structured chapters and carefully chosen examples. History classes don't lie. They simplify. In one country, the narrative centers on heroic resistance. Underground movements fill the pages. Acts of defiance become defining features of national identity. Monuments rise in honor of those who fought openly. Commemorations focus on courage under oppression, reinforcing a collective image of unity and bravery. In another nation, the emphasis shifts toward victimhood. The suffering endured takes center stage. Destruction, displacement, and loss are foregrounded, shaping a memory anchored in resilience through pain. The story becomes one of endurance against overwhelming force, a reminder of sacrifice and survival. Elsewhere, internal cooperation receives little attention. Administrative continuity is mentioned briefly, if at all. The grey zones of daily compromise fade into background noise, overshadowed by more dramatic elements. This absence does not always signal deception. It reflects priorities shaped by circumstance. Collective memory often mirrors post-war political needs more than daily lived experience. After liberation, governments must rebuild cohesion. They require narratives that foster unity rather than division. Emphasizing shared resistance can bind citizens together. Highlighting collective suffering can strengthen solidarity. Dwelling on internal ambiguity, by contrast, risks reopening fragile wounds. Textbooks, monuments, and public ceremonies elevate certain aspects while minimizing others. A single act of sabotage may be commemorated widely, while the years of administrative negotiation preceding it remain obscure. A national day of remembrance may focus on a dramatic turning point rather than on the long, repetitive routines that defined most of occupation. This shaping is subtle. It unfolds over time through curricular decisions, museum exhibits, and political speeches. It is rarely presented as distortion. It is framed as emphasis. Each society, consciously or not, chooses what to preserve, what to soften, what to forget. The emotional tone of remembrance varies accordingly. Some anniversaries feel triumphant. Others are solemn and mournful. Each carries its own weight, reflecting the lens through which the past is viewed. The deeper realization emerges gradually. Myth versus reality is not accidental. It is constructed. That construction does not require malice. It requires intention. Nations select stories that reinforce values they wish to promote. They prioritize narratives that sustain cohesion and legitimacy. The daily texture of compromise and hesitation. For audiences watching from different corners of the world, this perspective widens the frame. Occupation was not only experienced differently, it was remembered differently. A person raised in one country may grow up believing resistance defined the majority. Another may learn that survival under cruelty defined the era. Both can be sincere. Both can be partial. Understanding this does not dismantle national pride. It contextualizes it. It invites reflection on how memory is framed, how power influences storytelling, how education transmits simplified arcs across generations. And once national memory is recognized as shaped, rather than fixed, a final layer begins to reveal itself. If the story presented publicly influences perception, then the most intimate reckoning must happen within individuals, where inherited narratives meet personal morality. After tracing myths, silences, and national narratives, the lens narrows again. It leaves monuments and textbooks behind, and returns to something quieter, the individual. History, when expanded across maps and decades, can feel distant, but its most persistent echo lives inside personal reflection. One question remains. What would I have done? It is easy to imagine boldness from a position of safety, to picture oneself distributing leaflets in the dark, refusing orders with steady voice, standing firmly against injustice. Courage appears clean in hindsight. Resistance feels obvious when danger has already passed. But daily life under occupation reveals something more complicated. Most decisions were not dramatic. They did not unfold in single, defining moments. They accumulated slowly. A permit signed one morning, a conversation avoided one afternoon, a compromise justified as temporary. Survival did not announce itself as surrender, nor did endurance always resemble defiance. it arrived in increments. In a world where survival and principle collide, who do we become? The documentary does not accuse, it does not suggest inevitability. It invites humility. Under prolonged pressure, clarity blurs. Moral certainty bends beneath practical need. Hunger, fear, responsibility toward family. These forces reshape choices gradually, not all at once. Occupation daily life was not pure heroism. It was not constant betrayal. It was human. There were acts of bravery, visible and hidden. There were moments of complicity, willing and reluctant. But between these extremes lay days filled with negotiation. People recalibrated constantly. What was safe yesterday might be risky today. What felt justified one month might feel questionable the next. That fluctuation matters. It reminds us that morality under strain is dynamic. Judging from a distance simplifies what was lived in tension. Understanding requires imagining the weight of repetition, the exhaustion of sustained vigilance, the grinding monotony of restricted movement, the daily calculation of risk. The most unsettling insight is not about past generations alone. It is about ourselves. We inherit narratives shaped by pride and necessity. We debate interpretations across classrooms and public forums. Yet beneath all of it lies the same fragile core, human adaptability. That adaptability can preserve dignity. It can also accommodate conditions that once seemed unthinkable. Recognizing this does not diminish courage. It contextualizes it. It reveals that bravery stands out precisely because the default response to prolonged strain is survival. Understanding occupation becomes less about categorizing others and more about recognizing our own limits, not as an admission of weakness, but as an acknowledgement of complexity. The question lingers softly, without demand for a fixed answer. It reshapes the story from a distant historical episode into a mirror. If moral clarity can erode gradually under pressure, then vigilance requires awareness. And that awareness extends beyond memory. Because the patterns seen in occupation, adaptation, normalization, subtle control, do not belong to one era alone. As the chapter closes, attention begins to shift outward again, toward the present, where different forms of authority and compliance may echo familiar psychological rhythms. Now step into the present. A modern city wakes before sunrise. Glass towers reflect the pale light. Traffic hums along mapped routes, calculated by invisible systems. On street corners, small cameras sit quietly above eye level. No one stares at them anymore. They are simply part of the architecture. Identification is no longer demanded. At checkpoints, guarded by rifles, it is embedded into daily transactions. A card tapped, a code entered, a fingerprint pressed against glass. Movement across borders between buildings, through digital spaces, is tracked not by shouted command, but by automated confirmation. Curfews are rare. Restrictions are often procedural. Access denied because a credential expired. A payment flagged. A post removed. The correction arrives not as confrontation, but as notification. This is not occupation. The comparison is not literal. The differences matter. Contemporary life in many societies includes freedoms that cannot be equated with past regimes of control. Yet beneath those differences, certain psychological patterns echo quietly. Control operates most efficiently when it appears routine. During occupation, authority did not rely solely on force. It relied on predictability. Papers were stamped according to procedure. Permits followed recognizable formats. Patrol routes repeated. The very regularity made compliance easier. People adapted because systems were structured. Authority did not need constant violence. It needed participation. What if the most powerful control is the one you no longer notice? Modern systems function through embedded compliance. We show documents without protest because it feels normal. We follow regulated pathways because they are efficient. We accept algorithmic decisions because they appear impartial. The process feels procedural rather than coercive. The familiarity is the key. When routines are built gradually, they rarely trigger alarm. Each adjustment seems minor. A new policy introduced for safety. An updated verification step for security. A minor shift in access conditions. none dramatic on their own. Together, they shape behavior. The psychological lesson from occupation, daily life, was not merely about resistance or submission. It was about adaptation. Humans calibrate quickly to structured authority, especially when that authority operates consistently. Adaptation reduces friction. Friction draws attention. Overt oppression announces itself loudly. It invites opposition. Subtle control embeds itself into habits. It blends with convenience. It presents itself as necessity. By the time it feels restrictive, it may also feel indispensable. This is not an alarm. It is an observation. Power, in its most enduring form, prefers invisibility. It functions best when citizens internalize procedures as natural, when compliance becomes reflexive rather than considered. In the marketplace under occupation, showing a permit became routine. Today, showing identification in various contexts rarely provokes reflection. The gestures differ in scale and meaning, but the psychology of repetition remains. Awareness lies in noticing the gradual. When systems change incrementally, adaptation follows quietly. People adjust not because they are passive, but because routine offers stability. Stability is comforting. Predictability reduces anxiety. The subtle shape of power is procedural, not dramatic. And if authority no longer depends solely on visible force, then any meaningful response cannot rely solely on visible defiance. Resistance, too, must evolve quietly, mirroring the softness of the structures it navigates. When power becomes procedural, response changes shape. In the past, resistance often conjured images of sabotage and secret meetings. But even then, it rarely began with dramatic gestures. It began with preservation, a language spoken at home when it was discouraged in public. A banned song remembered and passed down softly. A fact shared discreetly, trusted from one hand to another. Resistance rarely begins with shouting. It begins with noticing. Today, open rebellion is not always the first instinct in societies shaped by structured systems. Instead, response unfolds in subtler ways. It appears in the act of questioning a headline before accepting it. It lives in the decision to verify information independently. It grows when individuals create communities beyond centralized narratives, spaces where conversation is not dictated by algorithms or slogans. These acts are not loud. They rarely make news. Yet they accumulate. The twist is easy to miss. Resistance, in its most durable form. It thrives in overlooked spaces, in networks that do not announce themselves as opposition, but function quietly as alternatives. In occupation history, underground movements survived because they were fragmented and discreet. They did not challenge authority head. On every day, they persisted beneath it. The psychological courage required for this persistence is understated. It is easier to comply without thought than to remain mentally attentive. It takes effort to question narratives presented repeatedly. It requires discipline to preserve independent judgment in environments designed for convenience and speed. The smallest acts of critical thinking can feel insignificant, yet they form the foundation of autonomy. Modern resistance rarely resembles a crowd in the square. It looks like an individual closing one source and opening another. It looks like conversations held thoughtfully rather than reactively. It looks like building relationships rooted in trust rather than trend. None of this guarantees moral superiority. It simply represents awareness. Under occupation, some people resisted by refusing to let their culture dissolve quietly. They maintained traditions behind closed doors. They taught children songs that did not appear in official curricula. Their defiance was not theatrical. It was protective. Today, the parallel is less about foreign rule and more about the preservation of independent thought within systems that reward conformity. The environment differs, but the psychology echoes. The instinct to notice when something feels misaligned. The decision to investigate rather than assume. Resistance, reframed in this way, is not noise. It is persistence. It does not require anger to function. It requires steadiness. It grows slowly, often unnoticed by the structures it quietly resists. By the time it becomes visible, it may already be embedded in habits, conversations, and alternative ways of organizing information. This perspective avoids simplification. It does not divide the world. into oppressors and rebels. It examines a deeper pattern, how individuals maintain autonomy within structured systems. And beneath that pattern lies something more enduring than politics. Because the deeper parallel is not about authority or opposition alone. It is about human nature itself, the way we adapt, the way we question, and the delicate line between acceptance and awareness. Human beings adapt. It is one of our most reliable instincts. We adjust to new routines, new rules, new structures because adjustment preserves stability. Without it, daily life would collapse into constant friction. Adaptation keeps families functioning, businesses operating, cities moving, under occupation. Adaptation was essential. Checkpoints appeared at familiar intersections, and soon they were woven into mental maps. Curfews rearranged evenings. Ration cards redefined shopping. People learned new rhythms, not because they approved of them, but because survival demanded continuity. The shift didn't happen overnight. It happened one small adjustment at a time. At first, each change felt sharp. The first time someone lowered their voice in public, the first time a permit was required for something once simple, the first time a uniform stood where it never had before. But repetition dulls edges. What once provoked shock gradually becomes expected. This is not weakness. It is human psychology. Yet, over time, adaptation can blur into acceptance. The line between "I must adjust" and "this is simply how things are" grows thinner with each routine day. Checkpoints become landmarks, restrictions become logistics. The extraordinary folds into habit. The most profound lesson from occupation daily life may not concern political systems alone. It may concern this very tendency, the normalization of gradual change. In modern societies, the adjustments look different. Procedures update. Technologies evolve, policies expand incrementally. None of these shifts feel catastrophic in isolation. They are introduced with explanation, often with benefit attached. Convenience, efficiency, safety. People adjust because adjustment is easier than resistance, not because they are unaware, not because they lack critical thought, but because incremental change rarely triggers the urgency reserved for sudden disruption. A new verification step here, a new rule there, each manageable, each reasonable on its own. The accumulation is harder to notice. This section does not accuse. It invites reflection. Adaptation protects us. It allows continuity in uncertain conditions. Without it, societies would fracture under minor pressure. But the same mechanism that safeguards stability can also reshape perception without dramatic signal. How do we recognize when adaptation serves us, and when it quietly reshapes us? There is no simple formula. Awareness begins with attention to increments, with noticing not only what changes, but how frequently it changes, with asking whether a routine adopted out of necessity still serves its original purpose. Misunderstanding occupation can be dangerous for a subtle reason. If we believe control only exists when uniforms are visible and violence obvious, we overlook the quieter forms authority can take. We assume that as long as spectacle is absent, autonomy remains untouched. But control rarely announces itself loudly. It embeds, procedural and predictable, into the flow of daily behavior. The fragile line between adaptation and acceptance is not fixed. It shifts with context, culture, and time. To observe it is not to live in suspicion. It is to remain conscious of how human flexibility operates. Occupation taught that normalization could occur under pressure. Modern life teaches that normalization can occur under convenience. Between them lies a universal insight about human nature, not about fear alone, but about how we survive, adjust, and redefine normality without always noticing. And perhaps that same adaptability that made us vulnerable also holds a different story, one that looks not at control, but at resilience. A mother stands in line before dawn, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. The ration cards in her hand are folded so many times the edges have softened. She does not speak much. She watches. She calculates how long the flour must last, how far she can stretch a small portion into several meals. Behind her, others wait with similar quiet determination. No banners wave. No speeches rise. The scene looks ordinary, almost mundane. Yet beneath the stillness lies effort. In a dim classroom, a teacher continues her lessons under revised guidelines. Certain topics are avoided, certain names omitted, but she still teaches children to read carefully, to think, to ask questions in ways that do not draw attention. She adjusts the surface without surrendering the foundation. Outside, a worker repairs a water line beneath the watchful gaze of uniformed patrols. His task is simple: keep the system functioning. Without him, entire neighborhoods would suffer. It is easy to overlook this kind of endurance. History favors spectacle. It remembers daring sabotage and dramatic defiance. But daily survival required a quieter strength. It demanded consistency when fear pressed at the edges of routine. It required waking each day and choosing continuity over collapse. What if staying alive was the bravest thing most people did? Occupation sought control, but communities sustained continuity beneath it. Families preserved their structures, even as external authority shifted. Meals were shared. Stories were told softly in familiar language. Festivals, stripped of public display, survived in modified form within homes. Traditions were reshaped but not erased. These actions may not resemble rebellion, yet they resisted something deeper. The erosion of identity. A culture is not sustained only by public declarations. It survives in habits, in songs remembered, in recipes passed down without written record. Even under restriction, people guarded these fragments carefully. They adjusted their expressions to avoid danger, but they did not abandon them entirely. Survival became its own statement. It said that children would grow, learn, and inherit something intact. It said that occupation could alter structures, but could not easily extinguish what bound people together. This form of courage is not dramatic. It does not seek recognition. It exists in repetition, in the steady preparation of meals, in the maintenance of infrastructure, in the patience required to endure monotony without surrendering hope entirely. The strength demanded by ordinary behavior under pressure is difficult to measure because it lacks spectacle. It asks individuals to carry tension privately, to navigate compromise without losing their core sense of self. It involves restraint as much as action. Looking back, it becomes clear that if daily life had collapsed entirely, open resistance would have had little foundation. Continuity created space for eventual change. Communities that maintained cohesion were better prepared to recover. This perspective reframes endurance. It moves the focus away from isolated dramatic acts and towards sustained effort. It recognizes that courage does not always appear as confrontation. Sometimes it appears as persistence. The mother in line, the teacher in the classroom, the worker under supervision. Their choices were not neutral. They upheld the basic functions of society, preventing fear from unraveling it completely. If survival required such strength, then it did not occur in isolation. Endurance spread through relationships, through shared understanding and quiet cooperation. Behind every individual act of persistence stood a network that made it possible. Behind the visible routines of occupation, another layer unfolded quietly. It did not march or declare itself. It did not distribute manifestos or claim headlines. It moved between kitchens and workshops, between stairwells and market stalls. Carried in gestures so small they could be mistaken for habit. A loaf of bread divided discreetly. A sack of potatoes left at the right doorstep without explanation. A warning passed in a sentence that sounded ordinary to anyone listening casually. These were not dramatic acts. They were threads woven into the fabric of survival. The strongest resistance sometimes leaves no monument. Much of what sustained communities never appeared in official records. No archive lists the times a neighbor knocked gently at midnight to signal danger. No plaque commemorates the women who adjusted recipes so that scarce ingredients could stretch across more tables. No report details the coded phrases used to signal when patrols were near. Yet these actions mattered. Mutual aid networks developed not as organized conspiracies, but as extensions of trust. Trust was fragile under occupation, shaped by fear of informants and suspicion. To help another carried risk. Sharing information could expose both giver and receiver. Each act of cooperation required judgment about character and timing. Solidarity was quiet, but it was present. People who disagreed politically still shared supplies, because hunger did not recognize ideology. Families with slightly more resources offered small support to those with none. Craftsmen exchanged skills without payment. Children were watched collectively, so that parents could attend to urgent tasks without drawing notice. None of this resembled open rebellion. It did not challenge authority directly. Instead, it strengthened the social bonds that authority strained. By preserving connection, these networks reduced isolation. They ensured that despair did not deepen into collapse. The emotional tone of these interactions was often intimate. A glance of reassurance across a crowded room. A brief squeeze of the hand conveying shared understanding. Words rarely spoke their full meaning aloud. Trust was embedded in tone and timing. In environments saturated with suspicion, maintaining such networks required courage. It demanded discernment, knowing whom to rely on, when to remain silent, when to offer help. Mistakes could be costly. And yet, despite risk, cooperation persisted. History tends to remember large gestures. It recounts uprisings and dramatic defiance. But daily cooperation prevented communities from fracturing entirely. It sustained morale. It kept families connected. It allowed small spaces of safety within broader constraint. Without these invisible systems, endurance would have been far more brittle. They reveal an essential truth. Resistance is not always confrontation. Sometimes it is preservation. Sometimes it is the decision to keep trusting another person, despite pressure to withdraw. The networks that weren't visible demonstrate how strength diffused across ordinary relationships. They show that courage can be collective without being public. And once we recognize the quiet architecture of solidarity, another dimension begins to emerge. After survival and cooperation, after endurance and persistence, there remains the question of how communities heal. Resilience alone does not guarantee understanding. Something else must follow. Something that addresses wounds not recorded in documents. There is no honest telling of occupation that avoids harm. There were betrayals. There were arrests that never reversed, losses that never healed, decisions that caused lasting pain. Some chose advantage over loyalty. Some reported neighbors. Some enforced rules with unnecessary cruelty. These realities cannot be softened without distortion. And yet harm was not the only presence. There was endurance that did not fit slogans. There was moral strain carried quietly behind closed doors. There were compromises made under pressure that looked different when removed from their urgency. Within the same street lived cruelty and care, selfishness and sacrifice, all braided together in daily life. To understand them, we must first admit how little we know. The temptation to judge is strong because it simplifies. Judgment arranges people into categories. It reassures us that we would have acted differently, but daily life under occupation rarely offered clean choices. Most decisions unfolded without guidance, without assurance of outcome. People acted with incomplete information, under sustained stress, within shrinking boundaries. They navigated immediate needs rather than abstract principles. Understanding this does not excuse wrongdoing. It does not erase accountability. It does something more difficult. It acknowledges that moral clarity under prolonged strain is fragile. The majority did not stand at clear crossroads with bright signs, pointing left and right. They faced narrow corridors with dim light, where each step carried uncertainty. Some steps proved admirable. Others proved regrettable. Many were simply attempts to hold families and communities together until conditions changed. History becomes more truthful when it accepts this ambiguity. Truth does not weaken when complexity is introduced. It becomes more human. It reflects the uneven terrain of lived experience rather than the polished symmetry of myth. It allows courage to remain courage while admitting that fear was real and compromise widespread. Expanding empathy does not mean dissolving responsibility. It means recognizing context. It means understanding that people under occupation were not symbols, but individuals responding to pressure with varying capacities and limits. Perhaps the most honest way to honor those who lived through those years is not to elevate them into untouchable heroes or reduce them to simplified roles. It is to see them clearly, to accept that they carried contradictions, that they adapted and resisted, complied and questioned, often within the same month. Such recognition requires humility from those who inherit the story. It asks us to approach the past not as judges delivering verdicts from safety, but as learners seeking understanding. It reminds us that endurance and error can coexist within the same life. The chapter closes without applause or condemnation. Only quiet reflection. Occupation was neither a tale of pure darkness, nor a legend of unwavering light. It was a human condition shaped by pressure and preserved by persistence. And as we move toward final synthesis, the task becomes clearer, to separate myth from lived reality fully, to ask what future generations must remember differently, not to diminish pride. Return to the image that opened this journey. The narrow street, the heavy boots, the brave faces in shadowed rooms, planning defiance, the clear divide between occupier and resistor. In that version, courage stands firm, betrayal is exposed, and justice eventually restores balance. It is a story shaped for the screen, for ceremony, for textbooks that must condense years into chapters. We know this version well. Dramatic resistance, clear villains, unbroken courage. It is a narrative that settles neatly into memory. It assures us that identity remained intact, that a moral core endured no matter how severe the pressure. Heroes become anchors in turbulent history. Their certainty reassures those who inherit the story. But why did this version become dominant? Societies emerging from trauma need stability. After years of fear and compromise, clarity feels like relief. A simplified narrative protects collective dignity. It allows communities to stand together without reopening every difficult question. Pride replaces confusion. Certainty replaces doubt. What if the story we inherited wasn't false, just incomplete? The first reveal arrives quietly. Myths are not always lies. They can be coping mechanisms. After collective trauma, complexity destabilizes. It reintroduces uncertainty into a period people long to resolve. It forces acknowledgement of moral ambiguity at a time when cohesion feels more urgent. It is easier to believe that most resisted than to confront how many simply endured. That belief does not emerge from deception alone. It arises from emotional necessity. To emphasize widespread defiance creates a shared identity rooted in courage. To dwell too heavily on compromise risks, fracturing fragile unity. Simplified memory travels smoothly across generations. It fits textbooks designed for young minds. It supports ceremonies that must inspire, rather than complicate. It provides clear symbols for monuments and anniversaries. Children learn the broad strokes and carry them forward, often without sensing the spaces between them. The story becomes stable, repeatable, safe, but something is missing. The baker who kept working under watch, the clerk who stamped papers to keep hospitals supplied, the teacher who revised lessons while preserving unspoken truths. Their experiences sit in the margins, neither erased nor fully embraced. They do not disrupt the narrative, but they are not central to it either. Over time, absence feels natural. If it is not emphasized, it seems less important. If it is less important, it fades. Yet it shapes daily life for the majority. Recognizing this does not dismantle heroism. It reframes proportion. It acknowledges that courage existed alongside compromise, that endurance was as defining as defiance. Myth was built not only to persuade, but to protect. It shielded communities from the weight of ambiguity. It allowed generations to move forward with coherent identity. If myth offered comfort, what does reality offer? Reality offers depth. It offers understanding at the cost of simplicity. It requires courage of a different kind. The courage to accept that history contains contradiction, that moral clarity is rarely absolute. And if myth once served a purpose, then confronting fuller reality demands its own strength. When the protective layer of myth thins, what remains is not drama, but texture. Daily life under occupation did not move in a single direction. It fluctuated. One week carried fear sharp enough to silence a neighborhood. The next settled into routine, uneasy but functional. Moments of defiance appeared like brief sparks, then faded back into practical decisions shaped by necessity. There were resistors. Their courage was real, and often costly. They operated in shadows, knowing the consequences. There were collaborators too. Some sought advantage. Others yielded under threat or calculation. But between those visible poles stood the majority, navigating a landscape without clear markers. They endured. Endurance is not cinematic. It lacks the clean narrative arc of rebellion. It requires patience, rather than spectacle. It involves making choices that feel smaller in the moment, yet heavier in hindsight. The most honest portrait of occupation daily life is emotionally uncomfortable because it mirrors ordinary human limits. If most people simply endured, what does that say about all of us? That question unsettles precisely because it closes the distance between past and present. It removes the safety of imagining that we would automatically stand on the most admirable side of history. It acknowledges that under prolonged pressure, ideals compete with survival. Occupation becomes less an isolated chapter of political history and more a study of human behavior under strain. It reveals how easily certainty can erode when confronted with hunger, fear, or responsibility toward loved ones. It shows how quickly routine can absorb the abnormal. This is not an accusation. It is an invitation. To view daily life under occupation honestly is to accept that moral clarity often shifts in context. The shopkeeper selling bread did not see himself as serving power. He saw himself feeding children. The teacher revising lessons did not feel heroic or treacherous. She felt protective. Even those who resisted openly navigated doubt, fear, and calculation. Reality offers humility. It dismantles the extreme image of societies, divided neatly into heroes and villains. It replaces spectacle with fluctuation. Fear one morning, routine. That afternoon, silence in public, kindness in private, compromise in one setting, quiet defiance in another. Humility does not weaken understanding. It strengthens it. It encourages reflection without harshness. It asks us to recognize that behavior under pressure rarely aligns with the narratives constructed afterward. The emotional atmosphere grows still. There is no crescendo here, no dramatic reversal. Only a slow acknowledgement that history, when stripped of exaggeration, becomes more intimate. It feels closer to our own lives. It reveals patterns we recognize in ourselves: adaptation, calculation, moments of courage, moments of hesitation. To accept this is to accept that we are not immune to similar forces, that resilience and vulnerability coexist, that the capacity for quiet endurance is widespread. With myth and reality separated, we stand at a threshold. The story no longer rests on simplified reassurance. It rests on nuanced understanding. And from this understanding arises a final question, not about what happened, but about what we choose to carry forward. Memory is never neutral. Every generation, quietly and sometimes unconsciously, edits the past. Certain moments are illuminated, repeated, taught in classrooms, and honored in public squares. Others retreat into shadow, mentioned briefly or not at all. This process is not always deliberate. It is part of how societies sustain themselves. We choose what to carry forward. Acknowledging the daily complexity of occupation does not dishonor bravery. On the contrary, it clarifies it. Heroism stands out precisely because it was difficult and rare. If everyone resisted openly, courage would not feel exceptional. It would feel expected. Survival stands out because it was exhausting and constant. It required spectacle. Both belong in the story. When myth dominates, it elevates certain figures and reduces the rest to background. When reality is embraced, those backgrounds gain texture. The mother in the ration line, the worker maintaining water pipes, the neighbor sharing news carefully. These lives were not footnotes to resistance. They were the majority experience. What kind of truth are we strong enough to carry? That question lingers because memory is also emotional. To accept a more layered past means accepting discomfort. It means admitting that identity is built not only on moments of triumph, but on years of negotiation. It requires confidence strong enough to tolerate ambiguity. The most meaningful remembrance may not be one that glorifies or condemns, but one that understands. Understanding does not weaken collective dignity. It deepens it. It honors those who acted bravely without ignoring those who endured quietly. It recognizes that resilience often looks ordinary, It accepts that fragility and strength can coexist within the same community. As we pull back from individual stories and national narratives, Occupation begins to look less like an isolated chapter confined to one era. It becomes a mirror. It reflects human resilience, the ability to adapt, persist, and protect what matters. It also reflects human fragility, the ease with which routines can absorb abnormal conditions, the speed with which fear can narrow choice. This mirror is not meant to accuse. It is meant to illuminate. Separating myth from lived experience allows a fuller view. It gives space to courage and compromise, to solidarity and strain. It encourages us to remember in a way that is neither self-congratulatory nor self-condemning. Every generation will edit. That is unavoidable. The question is not whether editing occurs, but how consciously it is done. Will complexity be trimmed away for comfort? Or will it be integrated? Even when it unsettles. The story of Occupation does not demand a single verdict. It invites reflection. It suggests that truth, when approached with humility, can sustain identity more honestly than myth alone. As this chapter closes, the image shifts outward. The narrow street returns in memory, quieter now, layered with understanding. The journey began with an ordinary morning. It will end there too, but not with the same assumptions. The past remains unchanged. Our way of seeing it has not. Return to the street where this journey began. It is early. Dawn spreads pale light across stone walls. A bakery door opens with a familiar creak. Warm air drifts outward, carrying the scent of bread into the cool morning. A child walks along the scent pavement with a satchel slung across one shoulder, step steady, unhurried. Windows begin to brighten one by one as residents wake to another ordinary day. Nothing looks remarkable. And yet, everything feels different now. When we first stood on this street, we carried an image shaped by cinema and ceremony. We expected noise, confrontation, visible struggle. Instead, we found routine. We found people moving carefully through familiar tasks while something heavier pressed invisibly against their choices. Occupation daily life was not what we imagined. It was quieter, more complex, more human. The ordinariness was the most profound element. There were moments of fear, yes. There were sudden ruptures that shattered households and neighborhoods, but most hours were not defined by spectacle. They were defined by repetition, by standing in lines, by adjusting lessons, by signing papers, by exchanging glances that said more than words. It was just a morning. And that was the point. The bakery did not close forever. The child continued walking to school. Trams resumed their steady paths. Yet beneath these motions lay invisible negotiation. Every routine carried calculation. Every simple act unfolded within altered boundaries. What once appeared peaceful now reveals layers. The same street seen earlier as calm simplicity now holds tension in its shadows. Who is watching? Who is choosing silence? Who is quietly preserving something that cannot be spoken aloud? The FALDs remain unchanged. But perception has shifted. History is not only forged in dramatic turning points, it is lived in routine moments, in kitchens and classrooms, in offices where permits are stamped and conversations trimmed, in early morning when bread is baked despite uncertainty. The reshaping that occurred here was gradual. Perception altered first. What felt abnormal slowly became familiar. Identity adjusted next. People began to see themselves differently, to measure their choices against new definitions of safety and responsibility. Moral boundaries, once firm, grew flexible under sustained pressure. None of it arrived with a thunderclap. That is why it is easy to overlook. When we expect history to shout, we miss the way it whispers. When we look only for visible drama, we overlook the slow shifts that redefine normality. The street at dawn does not announce transformation. It carries it quietly. Now, standing here again, the image holds more weight. The bakery's warmth is not merely comfort. It is continuity. The child's steady walk is not merely routine. It is resilience. The stillness is not emptiness. It is layered with memory. Closure does not require spectacle. It requires recognition. The journey began by questioning the image in our minds. It arrives here with clearer eyes. Yet the story is not fully complete. One final reflection waits beyond this quiet morning. Now, the distance narrows. After tracing myths and memories, compromises and courage, the focus shifts from streets and nations to something closer. It settles gently on you. Not accusing. Not demanding. Simply present. One question remains. What would we do? It is tempting to answer quickly, to imagine ourselves bold, unwavering, certain, to picture a clear line we would never cross. But moral certainty is easiest when conditions are stable, when choices are hypothetical, when consequences are abstract. Under sustained pressure, clarity behaves differently. Daily life under occupation did not offer grand crossroads with dramatic signage. It offered incremental shifts, a rule introduced here, a restriction adjusted there, a compromise justified. It solved an immediate problem. The world did not transform in a single day. It leaned, slightly, again and again. If the world shifted slowly around you, would you notice? Human beings are adaptable. That is one of our greatest strengths. We adjust to new environments, new technologies, new expectations. Adaptation preserves stability. It reduces panic. It allowed continuity. But adaptation also has a quieter effect. When changes occur gradually, boundaries can blur without announcement. What felt unthinkable at first becomes tolerable. What felt temporary begins to seem permanent. The line between protection and participation softens under repetition. This is not a flaw. It is human nature. The most personal reveal of this story is not about past generations. It is about the universal reality that no one truly knows how they will respond until the pressure becomes real. Imagining ourselves inside extreme circumstances is easier than living within sustained uncertainty. Understanding daily life under occupation is not about guilt. It is not about measuring ourselves against those who endured conditions we have never faced. It is about humility. Humility recognizes that strength and vulnerability coexist. That courage may surface in unexpected moments, and hesitation may appear where we least anticipate it. That survival can feel like resistance one day and compromise the next. History does not offer simple reassurance. It offers perspective. It reminds us that resilience is built through repetition, not only through dramatic acts. It shows that endurance requires stamina as much as conviction. It reveals that adaptation can both preserve identity and reshape it gradually. Awareness is the quiet lesson. To observe how slowly perception can shift. To notice how routines anchor behavior. To ask, occasionally, whether the structures surrounding us align with our values or have simply become familiar. This reflection does not invite fear. It invites attentiveness. The question lingers not as a test, but as an invitation. To consider how we live within systems. To recognize that moral clarity thrives when examined, not assumed. We do not need dramatic uniforms to challenge us. Subtle change can shape us just as surely. And with that recognition, the story approaches its final movement. Not toward judgment, but toward synthesis. Not toward certainty, but toward understanding that complexity itself may be the most honest legacy we can carry forward. After all the layers have been examined, the answer grows clearer and quieter. Daily life under occupation was not constant terror. It was not endless gunfire, nor streets forever frozen in panic, and it was not widespread rebellion either. Most people were not hiding in sequin rooms plotting dramatic resistance. They were waking early, calculating rations, adjusting words, and deciding what was necessary for one more day of stability. The myth was dramatic. The reality was human. What really happened was endurance under constraint. It was quiet calculation at kitchen tables. It was fear woven carefully into routine so that routine could continue. It was resilience hidden, plain sight, so ordinary that it rarely looked heroic. People adapted. They preserved what they could: language, family structure, cultural memory. They compromised when necessary, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with hesitation that lingered long after. They resisted when possible, often in gestures so small they never appeared in official history. And above all, they survived. Survival was not passive. It required attention. It demanded the steady management of risk. It asked individuals to weigh principle against immediate need, to move through days where certainty was scarce. There were resistors whose courage deserves remembrance. There were collaborators whose actions caused harm and must not be softened. But between those poles lay the majority, navigating ambiguity, without applause or absolution. That is what really happened. Understanding this does not weaken history. It strengthens it. It replaces legend with lived experience. It transforms occupation from a distant spectacle into a study of human behavior, pressure. When we accept that most people endured rather than performed, the past becomes less theatrical and more intimate. It stops asking us to admire or condemn exclusively. It asks us to understand. The story began with a quiet street at dawn. We return there now. The bakery opens. Bread warms the air. A child walks with measured steps towards school. Windows catch early light. Nothing announces drama. Nothing signals transformation. Lies a history of adaptation, of compromise, of courage, woven into repetition. The world appears stable. History is loud when it breaks. It shouts in revolutions and collapses. It etches dates into monuments and headlines. But history is quiet when it shapes us. It works slowly, through routine. It reshapes perception before it alters borders. It adjusts identity, not in a single gesture, but in habits repeated over months and years. Occupation did not redefine humanity in a single moment. It revealed patterns already present. Our capacity to endure, to adapt, to hesitate, to help one another. And perhaps that is why its truth feels unsettling. Because when the uniforms disappear and the flags change, what remains is not spectacle but character, not myth but memory, not noise but reflection. The morning continues. People move. Life resumes, as it always does. And now, the image is no longer simple. It is layered, quiet, real. The myth promised drama. The reality offered something more difficult, something closer to us, human,